Welcome to our WestWind Creative Valentine Gnome project. I was so excited to have the opportunity to make these for a customer, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what I did. First, I found some great fuzzy socks from the Target One Spot, and I utilized a mason jelly jar and some poly pellets to make the base filling for our gnome. This gives him a little bit of squish factor on the bottom, but also a little bit of weight so that he stands up well. I measured about half a cup, so about 4 ounces from that jelly jar, and filled the bottom of the sock. Then I added polyfill to fill the rest of the sock. This is a great way to kind of continue to have the fullness of his torso, but not have the weight of filling the entire sock with the pellets. I've also seen and used dried beans or dried rice, and those things both work really well. Also, I just chose to use the poly pellets because I had them on hand, and also since I was making these for a customer, I didn't have to worry about things being food safe or whatnot. So once you get the filling to the place that you like, then just take some twine and tie the top of the sock really tightly. I tied it around the top and then flipped it over and tied it around the back as well. The next step is making the beard for your gnome, and I chose to use the yarn method for the beards on my gnomes because my customer wanted the gnomes to be pink, and it's difficult to find craft fur in pink. It's kind of difficult to find craft fur, period, here lately. But so I did a little bit of research and found some tutorials on how to utilize yarn for the beard on your gnome. What I did was I cut a cardboard square that was about the length that I wanted for my beard. This one happens to be about 5 inches by 5 inches, and wrapped the yarn around that card about 20 times. And you'll want to choose a thick yarn that will definitely spread well. And then instead of cutting right along the end of the card like you would say if you were like making a pom-pom to make an even split, I demonstrate here to take a moment and actually cut the yarn length about halfway down so that you have a shorter bunch on top and a longer bunch on the bottom. Part of the reason for that with the yarn I chose especially, which was a Lion brand hometown yarn, was that as I started to comb out the yarn and fluff it up, I would lose a little bit of it, and so then that gave me an opportunity to have some length that I could play with and shape as I was making the beard. So utilizing the wider teeth of the comb, I split the yarn pieces into segments, and then I went back. I think that's actually a really cute look, like if you're making a Santa Claus or something like that. I just wanted a little bit fuzzier beards for my Valentine gnomes. And so I went back with the fine tooth side of the comb and went ahead and worked more with my yarn. And this actually takes quite a while. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the yarn that you choose. I would recommend going to the craft store and trying to find the end of your skein and see how easily it will fray and what it's going to look like when it does that. I probably maybe would have chose a different option, something with a bit more wool in it, but I really loved this color, so I did what I had. The other part of my project that I used from the Target One Spot was these adorable dish towels. They were 2 in a pack for 2 for $5 in the Target, seasonal area. And I also had the added benefit that these dish towels even had cute little rickrack border on the bottom, which I'll reuse later in the project. So I'm using those to make the hats for my gnome, and what I'm doing here, the method that I used for my hat is that I took the towel and I made the bottom part of the towel kind of folded up like a hem, then used the body of my gnome to calculate the circumference that I would need for the bottom of the gnome hat. And then I just kind of did some basic calculations, and I also made a test hat with some scrap fabric before this to get a good estimate of the height that I wanted on my hats. And so for this particular hat, I was able to get about 10 inches in height out of a dish towel, and I was able to get 2 gnome hats out of each dish towel. So the one thing that I will share is that I probably would have been able to get more out of those towels, but because my towels had a pattern that was directional, I had to be a little bit more careful about how I cut those apart. You can find some other tutorials online as well about how to create these in a no-sew fashion. There's some folks who have demonstrated making the seams by using hot glue. There's also a lot of great tutorials about using cute socks or, you know, the orphan socks that you end up having in a basket in your laundry room, all of those types of things. So if you're not making a bunch and it doesn't matter to you whether or not they all look similar, then those are really great options for you to be able to try when you're making your gnomes, and then each one has its own personality. I found that I would have actually liked this guy to be a little bit bigger around the bottom, so I wish I would have given that a little bit more space, and I'll be paying attention to that when I make future gnome hats. But this one turned out really cute, and I went ahead and sewed that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance rather than gluing it together or using, you know, any of the other methods that might be a possibility. And then one of the things that I learned in this process of making the few that I have is that you really want to take the time to kind of fit your hat. Something that was special about the socks that I found was that they already had a cute little heart detail, and I wanted to try to utilize that in my project, but also just to get a basic idea of how the hat will sit on your body, if you need to remove any fluff, those kind of things. Before you get in there with your glue gun, you want to make sure that you're testing the fit several times because there's not really any going back from hot gluing fuzzy socks. I'm using a Surebonder cordless glue gun that I received as a Christmas present actually, and this was my first time to play with it, and I'm really liking it so far. It's nice to not have to deal with dragging the cord across my project area and trying to make sure that everything is out of the way for that. So then you need to glue the beard that you created onto your preferred side of the gnome body. How I did that was I just put a generous amount of hot glue near the knot where I tied the strings together, and placed that just underneath where the twine secured the sock closed at the top. For this gnome, I'm gonna make his hat standing up. And so I did go ahead and put a little bit of polyfill in the hat itself just to give it some structure and rigidity. I also made another gnome where his hat was more of a floppy style. I like both of those. It just really depends on your preference and the personality you want to see in your gnome. But if you do want it to stand up, I recommend putting a little bit of stuffing or filler into that, fabric scraps, polyfill, leftover yarn pieces, any of that, just to give it a little more structure. So I took the time to go ahead and fit that hat again. I wanted to make a little bit of extra fold, and so that the heart on the back would show and be fully visible. And I also want to make sure that I cover up all the places where the beard is tied together so that it has a nice full look on the front of the gnome's face.
Just the Surebonder glue that they got me, you know, with the Surebonder gun. I don't know if there's anything specific about it.
And then you take a moment to go around and secure the hat to the gnome on the rest of the edges. You know, I just love myself some hot glue. It covers a multitude of sins, and so you can really be flexible and try to figure out the best fit for your little gnome hat. Next, I went ahead and used a wooden bead for my gnome's nose. I took a little bit of separation on the yarn that created his beard just to kind of give the impression of a mustache. And you want to make sure that you tuck that little nose up into the hat just a little bit to make it look like his hat has, you know, scooted down over the top of his eyes. And one of the last details that I did for these gnomes was I utilized the rickrack that I mentioned earlier in the project that came from the edge of the towels, and I made a hat band with that, just hot glued that on the outside edge of the hat. And then I also used one of my little miniature pom-pom makers and some other yarn that I had available and created a pom-pom for the top of the hat just to add a little bit more detail and finish off the edge of the hat. I'm generous with the hot glue here because I want to make sure that my pom-pom stays and that it doesn't flop around on top of the hat. And give that a nice fluff, and then I went ahead and did a little bit more beard trimming just to shape it up and make it look a little bit more rounded along the bottom. And there you have it, your very own Valentine Gnomes.